Welcome to the Transport Leaders Podcast, where we discuss the breakthrough ideas and bold solutions transforming the future of transport around the world. Join a global community of transport leaders, professionals, academics, and advocates as we unpack transport's toughest challenges and spotlight the strategies driving real change. From system reform levers and political realities to sustainability and technological disruption, experienced transport professionals Graham McCabe and Russell King and their guests offer expert perspectives as we discuss ways to transform our transport systems.
G'day, I'm Graham McCabe. I'm the founder of Step Advisory, a transport planning and traffic engineering firm, and I've worked in consultancy and government for over 25 years across Australasia and Asia.
And hello, I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist and the founder of the Transport Leader blog and newsletter, and I've worked on the policy side of transport for around 20 years.
Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, Graham, we are going to be talking about fares, public transport fares, and things like cost recovery.
Well, that's a really interesting topic of conversation, and I'll just say that if you go to our Patreon, you can buy us a bus ticket or a train ticket to help us keep running this podcast.
Very nicely inserted in there, Graham.
Or organic ad insertion.
Very impressive. You're an expert. You're a professional. I'm very impressed.
Yeah. Okay, so fares is a really, really big topic. So let's talk about policy as a focus area. So why do we have fares?
I think you've got to start by thinking about how you want to pay for your public transport system. Right.
Can it be free like the roads?
Yeah, indeed. Right. So I think there's there is you see quite a lot of people who argue that we should treat public transport as we do things like health and education, because public transport provides a whole range of benefits to society in the same way that health and education does, and therefore we should make it free for everyone. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the crowd who believe that public transport should make a profit and be subject to the market. And the reason it doesn't make money is because people don't actually want it. And if people wanted it, it would make money. So those are kind of like the two extremes. I think it's fair.
Yeah, I was going to say, which is really interesting because the very first public transport systems were completely privately run. Because the cities of the Renaissance, Enlightenment period, were so overcrowded, and people wanted a better way to get around. So they started running horse and carriages privately, which then migrated into privately built railway lines. So they weren't subsidised by the government.
Yeah. And then along comes a new invention, which changes the game completely.
The motor car.
The motor car, indeed. Okay. And the reason it's not just that the motor car was competing with public transport. What we also did was we began subsidising the motor car in various ways, many of which are hidden to taxpayers and treasuries, quite frankly, who don't realise how much of the subsidies are going in. But so you've got obviously things like direct subsidies for purchasing vehicles sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
You've then got subsidies like fuel subsidies. So a lot of countries pay out a lot of money to subsidise the price of petrol.
Yeah.
And we haven't even got onto the infrastructure yet. So we spend a huge amounts of money on building and maintaining roads, and that's all a government subsidy in the most cases, because very few places, Sydney being a global leader in tolling, but most places do not toll their roads and provide them the roads to the community, not strictly speaking free, but at a very, very low price. They might have a road tax of some sort or a rego charge, which is a kind of fixed fee, relatively low, all right, which doesn't even come close to covering the costs of building and maintaining roads. And then you've got a massive one as well, which is things like parking infrastructure, which is huge amounts of land used for storing metal boxes.
So in the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, governments around the world invested very heavily in railways, to the point of building railway lines, which might have been primarily used for agricultural or mining purposes, that had very low passenger demand, and they kept on subsidizing them through to, in the case of the UK, the 1960s, with the Beeching inquiry, and in Australia more into the 1970s and 1980s. And whereas in America, the railways were privately owned and operated, and they had a lot of consolidation as the passenger numbers dropped, to the point of that their interstate rail system is a very, very insignificant in comparison to what it once was.
Yes, and it's heavily freight oriented, and most of their rail network is now owned by rail freight operators and rail freight providers, and so there is a public, interstate transport provider, Amtrak, but most of the track that it runs on, it does not own. It's mostly the freight railroads that it uses and pays fees for access.
Yeah, so we have I suppose two markets, which are one was heavily subsidized, and then the subsidy was flipped into being for roads. So you have the creation of the interstate highway system in the US, connecting freeways between the major cities in Australia and the UK, but Europe didn't quite go down that path. So was there a policy decision in the fair sense that kept people in Europe on public transport rather than migrating across to driving? Possibly with the exception of Germany, I suppose.
Well, even in Europe, the car still has the lion's share.
Yeah.
Right. So even though public transport is relatively good in parts of Europe, there are still large parts of Europe where the public transport system, is relatively light, and the focus is very much on the car. And you see that in, even in France, which has got extremely good public transport systems in its cities, and increasingly good connections on railways between regions and cities, including, TGV and high-speed rail. You just have to have a look at when they increased fuel prices, and the gilets jaunes, which is the sort of yellow vests, protests about higher fuel prices came out, right? So cars are still very sensitive in places with really good public transport in Europe. So,
okay. All right. So how do we go about, how do governments go about deciding how they want to set fares? So what are the policy levers that they're looking at, and the push and pull factors?
Yeah. So I think part of the challenge here is there are a number of things that fares can do for you, and there's a number of things that it can't do that people think it does.
Yeah, we're too grumpy old men. Let's start with the negative. What are the things that it can't do?
Most of the time, it doesn't. Lower fares, which are very popular in a lot of places, doesn't increase patronage. It doesn't increase people out of the car. Sorry, that's not quite correct. It doesn't tempt people out of their cars.
Yeah.
What it does do, lower fares and free fares, and there's lots of evidence for this, is it gets people out of walking and cycling as alternative modes. Okay, so if you take somewhere like, Melbourne's a good example, where in the inner city they have free trams. There's extensive research that shows it didn't reduce car use at all, or very marginally. What it did do very effectively was stop people walking from one stop to another, because they could now get on the free tram.
And Sydney had a similar thing with a free bus that ran around the CBD, and it was always quite amusing. So this is free George Street Light Rail, because you would have about 50 people waiting for a bus that was already full, that only took 60 people because it was free, even though there would be 20 buses that you had to pay for.
Yeah,
passed while they were waiting for that free bus.
And it's not just free fares, low fares do the same. So Queensland's recently introduced a 50 cents fare across the board, and they similarly have not seen people move out of cars, but they have seen increased patronage, either from people walking or cycling, or increased public transport trips.
Yeah.
The increased public transport trips does generate a welfare boost. Presumably it's for people who are, struggle to pay the fares normally, and so now they have an option to be able to pay, have multiple trips for the same price as they would have previously. Although I think what it misses is the other equation of what free and cheap fares does to the public transport system. So bottom line, free and low fares do not encourage people out of their cars. So from a whole of transport system, it's not good for, say, reducing congestion. It's a bad policy in terms of first order effects, and we'll talk about second order effects, because there are quite significant second order effects. But primarily get people out of their cars.
Yeah. What about ride hailing and transportation network services? So to give you an anecdote, I'm on the Gold Coast in southern Queensland presenting at the ITS Australia Summit. So rather than getting an Uber to our accommodation, which is quite close to the southern terminus of the Gold Coast Light Rail, we use the express bus. So we paid 50 cents. We use the express bus that stops 100 meters from where our accommodation is. So that that's economically destructive behavior, because we didn't spend the money on the trip. So I'm not adding value to the economy by giving an Uber driver 40% of the amount that I would have been paying.
We could talk about the economic impacts on these things, right? But I think at the macro level, services like the ride-hailing services, they tend to compete with buses. If you look around the world where they have been introduced in the last decade or so, they have tend to be at the expense of bus patronage, not from people driving. That means we've moved from buses being a fairly efficient mode of transport in terms of space utilization, to a less efficient space utilization. And in our cities, space is at a premium when it comes to this rate space, right? So that's not a good outcome. It's also not good for things like, emissions and those sorts of things as well. Plus, of course, when you're taking money out of the public transport system, the public transport system has less money to invest in, better services. It's not that those things, that doesn't necessarily mean that public transport should be protected, from alternatives that are better. But one of the reasons that the ride-hailing companies do well is because they benefit from the road subsidies that people who are driving their own cars benefit from as well. They benefit from, the roads being cheap, relatively, and subsidised in terms of maintenance and construction.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've had one lever, which is price. What other levers? So, we know treasury agencies, so the bean counters never want to subsidise public transport. So agencies are given directions to. Sorry, I won't say never. In parts of the world, because there are parts of the third sector operators in Japan which are highly subsidised by the local governments and provide rural train and bus services, which are not expected to make money, to maintain connectivity, as an example. So getting back to what we've talked about, price as a lever. What other levers do governments have?
To achieve what?
Well, in fare setting policy.
So the other thing I would say is in fares, that is a very powerful tool, which I think a lot of people don't understand, is around managing demand on the public transport system.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the public transport system costs and investments in infrastructure are about meeting peak demand. And peak demand typically only happens for a small window during the day, and now post-COVID, typically only for 3 days a week, right? So typically it's now the morning peak, 7 to 9, and often that peak in terms of public transport is actually much shorter than that. It's much smaller window, typically just before the 9 o'clock sort of rush to get to work. So you have your peak period in terms of the congestion on the public transport system. What that means is that if you just think about it in terms of demand, what you try to do often, and the engineering solution is, we'll try to meet that demand, and that means massive upgrades to, train stations, the number of trains that you're running, signaling systems, the whole gamut of the entire rail network, or more buses need to be run through, etc. Right? Which is very expensive solution to meet a demand for a very short period of time, just 3 days a week. Okay. An alternative is that you try to spread that demand so that you can meet the peak demand. And one way of doing that is through the fare box. So you charge peak fares. Okay. And so that encourages people who have the options to not travel during the peak and travel off peak. And so you're spreading your load. That doesn't mean that you therefore never have to upgrade to meet the demand on the peak demand, but it does definitely spread it out. And if you get it right, of course, what you can do is you can charge significantly higher prices during that peak, and you can offset that with lower prices in the off-peak period. Okay, to encourage that, and then you can decide whether you want to get an overall cost recovery broadly neutral of where you are now, or whether you want to improve cost recovery, and that kind of depends on your starting position to some extent and what your objectives are.
So that's a really interesting point about raising fares. So the political incentive is to lower fares, because then you're addressing cost of living, or delivering to the community. So when I've seen the introduction of off-peak fares, the ones that I know of, there've only ever been significant reductions in the off-peak price without a commensurate increase in the peak price. So, and going back to the economics, the incentives to change behavior, if somebody is already undertaking a behavior, you need to have a very disproportionate change in the cost of the activity.
Yeah, so in the fares space, what we see is if you increase the fares slightly above inflation, okay, even over an extended period, say 10 years or so, you don't see a change in behavior typically. People don't suddenly, shift out of using public transport and moving it.
Yeah.
If on the other hand you have
10-to-1 ratio.
Yeah. So if you, on the other hand, have a large increase, one-off increase, so say you have a situation where you haven't increased fares for, say, more than a decade, and you're then running short on money and you've got to make a catch-up, and so you're going to increase fares by, say, 25% or so. This is what's happening in Vienna in the new year. Then the evidence suggests that that sort of shock does change people's behaviour. So if you're increasing fares in a sudden sharp shock like that, you are almost certainly going to reduce significantly patronage on the public transport system. Right? So that's, so that will get people out of public transport and into their cars. So that's, a poor way of doing it, which is why steady increases, regular increases in fares is a very effective strategy. And if you do it slightly above inflation over time, your cost recovery improves and you can invest in better services, which is what's tended to happen in London over a long period of time.
Right.
So London's now, its cost recovery is close to 100%, i.e. its various revenue streams, including significant fare box revenues, mean it covers its operating costs. It doesn't cover capital costs, but it covers 100% or close to of its operating costs. Right. Now, compare that to Australia, where the average cost recovery is probably lower than 20% at the moment in the public transport system. I think after Queensland's cut in fares, it may as well be as low as 5%, which means that, for every $10 spent on public transport, $9.50 is coming from the taxpayer, only 50 cents is coming from the user. So the taxpayer is picking up the bill. The problems with these sort of very low fare policies and low cost recoveries is the second order effects.
Right.
So governments don't tend to actually fund properly these very low fares. What they tend to do is to say to the transport system, well, you need to absorb as much of these costs from these low fares as possible. All right. And what that tends to lead to is two things that need to be done. First thing is services get reduced.
Yeah.
Because they can't afford to run the services. So they have to look for savings. And so services that perhaps are providing low patronage services, but are important for, meeting people's needs where they can't drive out in, say, suburbia, they become even less frequent than they already are, and they're typically poor already. So say you might go from a bus every half an hour to a bus every hour, that sort of thing. And the second order effect is what they often do is reduce the maintenance money on public transport, because reducing maintenance in the short term, you don't really see a big impact. Okay. But your assets are continually running down, and you start then to see things like reliability and the cleanliness of your assets, and actually your operating costs of running those assets all going up because you haven't maintained them as well as you needed to. So it provides a short-term way of covering the costs of low fares, but it's hiding long-term implications. And you see that as, services, trains break down, buses break down more, they become older and more worn out. They can't afford to replace the buses. They can't afford to maintain them properly. And so people get worse services. So if you're then reducing the services and you're reducing the reliability, okay, over time, what happens then is patronage drops. So even though you've got these low fares in place, patronage then starts to drop over a period of time, and you often have a long drift down as patronage drops in those second order effects because you're not funding them properly.
Yeah.
I was going to say, oh, let's fund it properly. Okay. The
Yeah.
problem with that is you're always then up against other priorities. So if you're a state government in Australia and you're looking at operating costs and you're looking at where are the pressures at the moment, okay, you might go, well, actually, the public are telling us they want more money spent on healthcare, which is almost everywhere. This is the same. There's a massive healthcare pressure. Okay. And so and cost of living is another one, right? And so what happens is there's a bunch of priorities that are not public transport ahead of them. And so what you find is that transport gets squeezed when it doesn't have its own revenues. And so that's why free fares typically don't work, is they don't get prioritized. And so what you find is that where places do introduce free or very cheap fares, they sustain it for a while and then they give it up.
Yeah.
As a bad job. So Kentucky is a good example. You know, it's just reversed its free fares policy in the United States. So it started reintroducing fares. It was done as an exemplar for people who really liked free fares, but they haven't been able to sustain it, which is what happens most of the time. Similarly, Vienna, with very low fares, has found that as its budget's got tighter, it can no longer afford it. And so now it's saying, we're going to have to massively increase fares. And they could be in a doom loop now where they've massively increased fares, patronage goes down, the city government still has huge debt, so it's not as though there's going to be a new pool of money coming anytime soon. So if anything, they're going to need to increase cost recovery over the coming years, but they're in a situation where increasing fares is reducing patronage, which is then reducing fare take. It's a difficult scenario for them to be in.
Yeah, and that the death spiral of transit. You know, when you're trying to chase the same amount of or more revenue with an ever decreasing number of patrons and cutting services, which then reduces the number of patrons, and you add on top of that increasing fares. Well, you've time to go a bit Californian, I think, and start introducing a sales tax to pay for your public transport services.
Yeah, you know,
or some other mechanism, because you've lost the game on revenue. You won't come out of that spiral.
Yeah, the other challenge you have is which is the discussion is around equity. You know, and I'm not going to define what equity means in this space, because I think if we ended up asking 10 people, they'd end up with 10 slightly different answers in this space. But what people say a lot is, you know, public transport is a necessity for people on low incomes, okay, and if they have expensive, you know, fares, that then directly hits them, you know, on money they don't have, and therefore lower fares is a good piece. Now, a few things on that. Why would you give everybody free fares or low fares? Because for people, you know, at the lower end of the economic, you know, socioeconomic spectrum, okay, that seems a sort of real poor giveaway. So that's the first point. The second thing you end up with on this is in places like America, transit is now seen as something only for people on low incomes, right?
Outside of big cities.
Outside of big cities. So across the United States, only 4% of the population uses transit. Just 4%.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you think about, you know, New York, where that's numbers much higher, you know, it'll be, you know, probably, I don't know what the numbers are, but, you know, 40-50%. Place like Chicago, it'll be much higher, right? So, but across the country, it's just 4%.
Yep.
Right.
And that's the same in Australia, outside of CBD oriented journey to work.
Yeah. Right. And so public transport is not seen as something for everybody. I think it's not as bad in that sort of tarnish is not so problematic in Australia, but it is a challenge, right? And so what you end up with is a system that is then designed for that 4% in America's case, right? Rather than targeting it at providing a service for the majority of people.
Yeah.
So they're not. So that, you know, what they end up doing is then they're only providing a service for the very small population, for a very small proportion of the population, disproportionately who are on low incomes. The other problem you end up with is, because they're so short on money, the coverage for public transport in terms of providing good services to people who live in places where, you know, often in low incomes, they're well away from, you know, good public transport services. They become car dependent, and so they end up having to pay to have a car because the public transport is inadequate.
Yeah.
So by not investing in better services and putting in lower fares, you're helping people who have got access to public transport. But what about all those people that don't have access to public transport, good enough public transport, for example, to take them to work because of where they live? And so you're costing them more because you're not able to invest in growing them and improving the services, as well as for everybody else. I mean, you know, that would benefit from better public transport.
Yeah. So having free or very, very low cost fares doesn't work without a system which generates revenue. So you need to have something which is actually hypothecated, dedicated to creating a revenue stream for government, and we often see that one is done without the other. So when Queensland introduced its temporary 50-cent fares as a cost of living measure, they didn't say, well, at the end of the 2-year period, we're going to do X, Y, or Z. Actually, I think they used coal mining royalties. The then government said, we're trying to discourage coal mining, so putting words into their mouth, coal companies are taking the community for a ride, so we're going to double the royalties, and here's all the things we're going to put that money into. One of which was paying for the 50-cent fares.
Yeah. So
and then there's the change of government who get rid of that royalty, and now you don't have the revenue source to cover.
Yeah, and this often is the case, right? Is that, you know, a government's one revenue source will be for one government might not be palatable for another, right? And so it becomes a sort of unsustained revenue source for a government, right?
Yeah.
Now, one thing that works quite well in Sydney and New South Wales is they have a parking space levy. So we charge for every parking space in the CBD, there is a tax, a levy on each parking space, paid for by the landowner.
Yeah, it's about $3,000 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the revenue it creates, I think, is about $150 million a year. So a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. But of course, it's got very low coverage across the city at the moment, right? But one option is you could pick parking revenues to help cross-subsidize other parts of the transport system, and the advantage of that is that their parking fees are normally controlled by the transport agency, which then puts the money. So it's kind of considered in the transport bucket. So transport is then, if transport has those parking revenues, it theoretically is incentivized to maximize the revenues that it gets from parking in order to put into various other forms of transport. And in the UK, in London, London's councils, it works very well. So they're in control of parking on their streets. It's a significant revenue raiser. The money legally can only be spent on other transport things. They use that money to, for example, build cycle lanes and improve footpaths, and do traffic calming measures, low traffic neighborhoods, those sorts of things. Okay, so it provides a revenue source that can be used to cross subsidize other parts of the transport system.
I do recall when I was when we were starting to install the cycleways for the city of Sydney. One of the concerns was about the loss of parking revenue from on-street parking.
Yeah, I've had this argument with the chief financial officer of the council with regards. It was more on car share.
Yeah.
So it's like, we have this car share, but it's going to, which will, the research shows it broadly removes 10 cars or something in that sort of region.
Yeah, we can get into the validity of that study.
Yes,
at the time.
Yeah, we could talk about the numbers, but it does reduce the number of cars. Okay,
it reduces the number of second cars.
Yeah. Okay. But if you're talking about parking revenues, those second cars giving parking revenues to councils in terms of residents' parking fees, that's a loss of fees. And so if you're the chief financial officer of a council, you're like, well, I'm losing money from this thing. It may be better for the transport system, but how am I going to make up the money? And I think it's one of those, what you then end up with is a perverse rationale. It's like, we will charge huge amounts of money for the car share schemes to be able to park in this space because it's a dedicated space, etc. And there's a rationale for charging them a certain amount, but you kind of want to be optimizing the use of car share because of its potential to reduce, vehicles kilometers traveled, right? So you're kind of, there's a financial element there that's a bit perverse. But we digress from fares. The thing I would say that I find frustrating in this space is the welfare system is designed to help people on welfare, to help people redistribute income. Okay, using the transport system to provide welfare is a really second best at best solution, and often has very perverse negative impacts, as I say. So it worsens the transport system, okay, and isn't very effective and targeted at providing welfare. So if you want to provide welfare for people on low incomes, improve the welfare system. Don't do it through the transport system.
Yeah, and I know we've had this discussion about lowering fares versus investing in better services or more bus priority and things like that. And I think, unfortunately, too often at the policy side of things, it's very much seen as a either or. We can do bus priority or we can lower fares. Not, well, what's actually the thing that achieves the outcomes. Too much of the policy work is focused on outputs. Lowering fares is an output. As you've said, the outcome isn't people getting out of cars. It's people who already use public transport using public transport more. So you're probably actually just collecting the same amount of revenue, just people are making more trips and putting more strain on the system.
No, the revenue drops. Well, it depends on pricing, right, and stuff on that. But your revenues tend to drop significantly, right? I mean, certainly in the case of Queensland, it was already, the cost recovery was already very low, and it's even lower now.
Yeah.
So it doesn't compensate for
it. So people aren't making 7 trips where they were previously making 1.
No.
That kind of
Yeah, I think it's costing them. Was it something like, I think it's $700 million a year or something in terms of revenues for net. Okay, the one thing we didn't touch on as well is it destroys the business case for further investments as well, right? So your cost benefit ratio deteriorates because your fare box recovery is lower. So it makes the case for expansion of services. So I would argue that something like the extension of the Gold Coast Light Rail, which was cancelled, one of the factors would have been, well, how are we going to pay for these increased, all this extra patronage when we've got no fare box revenue or very little fare box revenue?
Yeah.
Right. And so the treasuries become much more reluctant to increase services because they're so heavily subsidised. Right. So one of the big advantages of having high cost recovery is expanding services doesn't cost you a lot more, a lot of extra money.
Yeah. So if we move to a more cost recovery focused fare system, going back to the fairness, pardon the pun, piece of low income and disadvantaged people, what does the research say about taking care of that in a cost recovery system?
Yeah, so you've got different options on how you do it. So in London's case, what it does is its tube fares and train fares are relatively high,
Yes.
but it keeps its bus fares relatively low. So across the system, although it gets 100% cost recovery, effectively it cross-subsidizes between the trains and the tube with the buses in order to maintain low bus fares. Okay, so that's how they
So
do it.
you're paying for speed in movement effectively.
Yes, I mean, yeah, that's right. I think that's a fair way of sort of characterizing it. So everybody has an option, but perhaps that option isn't as is not as great an option. But even with low bus fares, London has seen a reduction in bus patronage.
Hmm.
All right, in the last decade or so, I think. So it dates pre-COVID. It seems to start from when the ride-hailing companies came in.
Right. And which was also the time when there was a lot of investment in the cycling superhighways.
Yeah. So one of the characteristics in London as well is there has been a reduction in car use over a long period of time, but it has tended to go onto public transport. And actually, there's also a trend of public transport onto walking and cycling, particularly cycling. Okay, which then obviously you've got relatively high fares because they've invested in the cycling infrastructure, provides people with an option that's relatively, is very cost effective. Once you bought the bike, it's your maintenance costs are very low, and it's virtually free.
Yeah. So, interesting fare system is one where again, going back to that speed component, is where you have your local service. Talking about trains, your local service, your semi-express, and your limited express. And so you can get your local service, and it will take you a long time, but then you have the base fare, and then you pay a surcharge to go in speed and quality.
Yeah, so you might have an option of going traditional rail versus high speed rail.
Yeah.
Right. And the high speed rail is a premium priced product.
Yeah. Well, and even on standard rail services. So and the I'm not sure the British rail system's the best example, but the how far in advance you purchase your ticket also determining your
the UK's ticketing system is definitely not a good example. Nightmare Byzantium system. It's far too complicated and puts users off.
Yes.
That needs a massive overhaul, but whether it will get it under the new ownership structure where they have, is it Great British Railways?
We'll
have to wait and see. But certainly you can do things with fares in terms of dynamic pricing in the same way that you do with airlines. So you can use seat reservations, for example. Do you provide seat reservations and charge them a premium for seat reservations on intercity services?
Yes. Yeah, and you're having reserved carriages and unreserved carriages, and if you go in an unreserved carriage, then you take your luck on whether you get a seat or not. Well, one of the things the entire way.
I mean, one of the things on fares is we haven't covered yet is the concessions. Okay.
Well, there's more and more of them.
They're a nice political giveaway. It's the same. It's the same as lower fares, but for more limited groups. Okay, so lots of places give pensioners half price travel, for example, or very low travel. I think it's like Sydney, I think is it $2.50 and has been for more than a decade now, I think. Right. So again, struggling to put the price up. Right. They got into a bad habit of the price always stays the same. So it's generating less and less revenues. If you look at the New South Wales train system outside of Sydney, the vast majority of people sort of using the regional rail network
are on the $2.50 tickets.
Yes. So the cost recovery is absolutely horrific on those services, which means that over time those services have been pared back because no one is using them, and no one's paying the full fare.
Well, it's the traditional death loop of there's no cost recovery, so you reduce services, so people who can otherwise drive do drive.
Yeah,
which reduces the number of people who are paying a full fare. And similarly, it goes back to our discussion on buses, in that you can have a full bus in the middle of the day with 50 people on it, but if only 4 of them are paying a full fare and everybody else is on a concession, or it's a 50-cent ticket, then you have zero chance of recovering costs.
Yeah.
But you're providing a service. So I think
the question is whether or not it's a well-targeted service. So if all pensioners were poor, okay, maybe there's an argument that says, well, all pensioners should be entitled to free public transport. At least it strengthens the case. Okay, but we have a large proportion of our pensioner population, or those who qualify for the $2.50 concession, who are extremely well off, and well off both in terms of cash and asset rich.
Yes, I do know a person who ran a large transport consulting firm, owns sports cars, goes skiing internationally, suddenly become a public transport advocate, and years on, once he got his $2.50 a day public transport usage.
Yeah. Right. So whether or not that is a sensible use of public money, I would argue that it's not a good use of public money. Right. And that we would be better off targeting people based on the welfare system rather than through a blanket concession on transport. But the reason that these things exist is because they're very popular. Okay. So
how do we get I suppose a rational change from within the political system?
I wish I knew, because in this case the dynamics work out really badly. So for example, on the Queensland 50-cent fares, I think I've seen polling that says not more than 90% of the population of Queensland support it. Right now, in 5 years' time, I'm sure it'll be a shit show in Queensland as the services have deteriorated. Maintenance has been cut back, reliability's dropped, etc. And we see that as a regular sort of cycle, right? And then the government will be in trouble because it'll be like, why are our services so bad? Well, it's because we've got 50-cent fares over here, right? And then they've got a problem, right? Because unpicking a 50-cent fare when it's so politically popular is really hard as well.
So the government will have a revenue spiral. The treasurer will be beating the transport minister over the head and saying, you made this mess. The premier will probably be looking off in the other direction, going, nothing to do with me. I just continued a policy in place that was in place. Transport minister, why didn't you tell me it was costing so much? Treasurer, why didn't you make sure that we had the revenue?
Or the premier or a premier could just go, treasurer and transport minister, you sort it out.
And
the best they would come up with is, we need to increase fares a little bit. And they'll be like, oh, let's test the polling on that, you know, and it'll be a totally complete train wreck. You know, and that's the problem they're going to be. Now, I've got rid of a free fares policy in New South, you know, I say me, but, you know, as part of a team of people who are pulling together a proposal to change the free fares. You know, and we did it very successfully, but we made the case, we did a lot of groundwork on, you know, rolling the pitch and explaining to people the perverse incentives and why it wasn't working. And in that case, only, you know, about 20% of public transport users were benefiting anyway. So the majority of people on public transport weren't benefiting. And so when we unpicked it, you know, we came up with a system that was better overall for more people, even though it improved cost recovery as well, and delivered better network impacts as well. The way because we got rid of the double charging for switching modes.
Yeah. So do you just want to, you know, explain that more a little bit more for people who may not be with it? Yeah.
So in New South Wales, we used to have a situation where you used to be charged for 8 fares, and then anything after 8 fares, it was free.
Yeah.
And so what happened was that people would do 8 very cheap fares.
Yes.
Okay, the cheapest possible fares, and then they'd be able to abuse the system effectively with lots of free fares. And
people going one stop within, you had a 2-hour window, so they would do on Sunday morning they would take the bus 1 stop, and Sunday afternoon they take the bus 1 stop.
Yeah,
and that would knock off two of the fares.
Yeah. Okay, and so you'd end up with a lot of sort of it had perverse incentives in terms of how you use the public transport system, which was not in the interests of people in the spirit of what was trying to be achieved.
Yeah.
And what we also found was the vast majority of people that benefited from it were working middle-class men. Okay, because they would do their Monday to Thursday commute. This is pre-COVID. So they would do their Monday to Thursday commute, get their 8 trips, and then they'd get their Friday free. Whereas if you were a part-timer, you know, so you only worked 3 or 4 days a week, which is much more common for women, even professional women, okay, you know, with caring responsibilities, etc., they would never go to the free fares.
Yeah.
So when we talk to people about the current fare system versus an alternative fare system, they preferred the new fare system. Yeah. And when we'd explain the problems around the network interchange, so if you went from ferry to light rail, for example, you had to pay twice.
Yeah.
And we changed that so that you didn't end up getting double charged. So now there's a network interchange charge, which is about $1. Yeah. And so it's much cheaper now to interchange. And we needed that mindset of becoming a much more multimodal city as we built more options for people.
Yeah.
So a combination of removing the free fares, providing the network discount, more people benefited from the network discount than lost from the free fares policy. So overall, it was a better system from a fairer system as well, from a sort of social equity perspective, better system from a transport planning perspective. We just needed to explain it well to people. And because we did that, I think the fare reforms, even though it got rid of free fares, was very well accepted across the community with virtually no complaints.
Yeah, and there is a weekly cap on the amount that you spend.
There is.
Yeah. But going back to, you know, the issue of fares, then, like, you know, just even raising fares with inflation is a challenge. And in Sydney or in New South Wales, we have an independent pricing and regulatory authority, and they keep on recommending that fares are increased. And then the minister says, yes, thank you for your advice, we're not doing that.
Yes.
Because it's politically savvy to not be the one to raise the fares.
Yeah. So we for whatever reason, we have not got into explaining why. It doesn't. We're not talking about radical increases in fares, but just, regular increases in fares is a good thing for our transport system, and talking about the benefits of being able to invest that money back in. Okay, we kind of only got sort of the one dimension on it. It's also very hard at the moment because we've had relatively high inflation, higher than people's wages increases. Cost of living is the number one issue across Australia and in many parts of the world, because they've also suffered from inflation rises. And so that cost of living has become the biggest single issue for people. And so increasing fares is seen as directly attacking that. So you'll be seeing that not just in the fare box, but we're seeing it in tolling as well. So the government in New South Wales is paying money to people to drive by discounting their tolls, their road tolls.
Well, again, it's incentivizing more usage by having a weekly cap, after which the government will pay your tolls for you.
Yes.
Yeah. So
right.
Perverse outcome for a government which is very focused on addressing climate change.
Is it?
Well, encouraging people in fossil fuel cars to make extra trips, so that making it free for them to make extra trips on the motorway.
There's not large investments going into active transport, so which is the obvious way of reducing carbon emissions. So I think there's a little bit of we're getting off topic, but we'll have to net zero and carbon emission reduction policies generically and another thing. I think the challenge we have in fares is what is popular with the public and what works from a transport system perspective are not the same thing, and that creates space for politicians to create popular but bad policy, and that's very difficult. And it's not like it's low fares are a slightly popular policy, right? The fares in Queensland are a home run.
Yeah.
Okay. So in Queensland's case, when the former government announced that they would do it, the current government, when it was in opposition, matched the promise because it had to politically.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it would have possibly lost the election if they hadn't have done. Okay. And they were time limited, like that 50 cents fare was time limited. But then when the government looked at it, they felt that they could not go back to the old system, okay, because they felt that they would be, it would be very unpopular because of the low fares had been so popular. As I say, the chickens will come home to roost, in the next few years, and I'm sure that we will see services deteriorating across Queensland as a consequence. But that is, it's popular, and that's the problem. Is politicians chasing votes will go for bad policy, and it's really hard to unpick.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things I think in Australia is we don't have competition for the market in public transport. So we have competition to own the market through tendering, but all the revenues go back to government. But we don't have private railways. You are not allowed to set up a bus network as a competitor to government. So there's no incentive to compete on quality or speed in return for a higher price, because it's just too hard to do. The closest we get would be long distance travel, where you have, as we talked about, the pensioners getting their trains for $2.50, and that includes Sydney to Melbourne. You can get a train to Melbourne for $2.50 if you're
1,000 kilometres.
Yes. Along the same corridor, you have buses, which are actually faster than the trains. but that's a purely commercial operation. So you're looking, $30 to $100, depending on when you want to travel for that. And then you have the airlines, which are purely commercial operation, limited by their profitability and the number of landing slots they can get at the two airports.
Yeah.
And that's the only time that the only locations where we actually have true pricing signals of, you can take a 13-hour train, which, if you're paying full fare, is about the same as flying.
Well, so you're absolutely right. Within the cities, we don't have pricing signals, right? But it's not just. But the biggest pricing signal problem is not public transport, right?
It's usage.
Sorry?
It's road usage.
Yeah, it's road usage.
Yeah.
Right?
Which New Zealand's addressing.
Which New Zealand is addressing by, implementing road user charging across the country, hopefully. And we'll see how it goes in terms of implementation. But yeah, if we had road user charging, of cars, all right, then you would have, you would have more people wanting to use public transport. Right? Now, I would argue that at that point, you want to increase the fares of public transport to pay for improved services, because you've now got a lot more demand and you're going to need to run more trains, more trams. You're going to need to significantly improve those services. You need the money to pay for it. Or you can use the road user charging to cross subsidize, which is one of the things that happens in London as well. The congestion charge helps to cross subsidize public transport.
Yeah, there was a massive investment into public transport in the lead up to the implementation of the congestion charge, so that people had that alternative to move to. Yeah,
they significantly increased the number of buses available.
Yeah.
So I can't remember what the percentages was, but in and around the congestion charge zone, the number of buses increased substantially, so that people couldn't say we don't have an option.
Yeah. So a fair fare is an integrated movement charge.
What's an integrated movement charge?
I don't know. I just made it up.
Okay. That's an innovation.
Yeah. No, but so we talk about public transport fares. So if you want to go from A to B, and you've got your range of options, obviously you have your value of time, the cost of the movement, and the cost to society of you wanting to make that movement. So, I mean, in an ideal world, all those things would be balanced out, and you would pay accordingly. So it would be integrated. So you can so if you want to drive yourself, well, there's the cost of all your total cost to society of doing that, and you would pay that, and which would probably be a different cost.
So if you
or walking or cycling.
Yes.
Walking or cycling, you may actually get paid to do it because you're reducing your health costs to government.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the road user charge, and I think it was Engineers Australia, or they did a publication in terms of what they thought the user charge should be, and they had different levels depending on. So, for example, they had a part. They basically tiered up the charges, sort of had sections with different charges. So they had like an environmental impact charge. So if you're driving a internal combustion engine car, you'd pay more in that segment than you would if you were driving a hybrid, which would be more than if you were driving an electric vehicle. They also then had a charge for when you were driving. So if you're driving during a peak demand, you'd be paying more, and similarly where you're driving. So if you're driving out in the regions where there's not a lot of traffic, you're paying the rate you're paying is very low. If you're driving in the inner city where the space is at a premium, you're paying a lot more. Right. And so you can, so from a car perspective and charging, you can see how that sort of stacks up. So people are paying more when they're less environmentally friendly, driving during the peak, and in the places where spaces are the premium. Okay. And then what you want to be doing is making sure that compared to that price, public transport is attractive. So, and that will depend on a whole bunch of different factors, right? So if it's on a BRT line, say, right, you might be charging a premium for a bus rapid transit because you're getting very fast service compared to a parallel bus line, which is doing much more frequent stops and therefore is a much slower service.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And we don't have that tiered charging.
No, we don't have that sophisticated level of fare box. And as I say, our fare box policies for me are very primitive. We're not using them to manage demand. We're not using them to provide decent cost recovery so we can invest in better services. We just there are a bunch of political concessions, which when you add them all together is a smorgasbord of bad policy.
Okay. So to wrap up, do you think we can change?
No.
What a hopeful note to end on.
Yeah, I'm a grumpy old man. Well, I think we might have a different equation if we get to road user charging.
Yeah.
I think then that the equation might change in terms of how we fund our public transport system.
Yeah. So long as it's not a default vehicle mass multiplied by number of kilometers driven per year.
Yes. So that's problem number one. If it just becomes a, check on your speedo how far you've traveled, use it properly, have a much more sophisticated system than that. You also want to avoid a situation which some people are lobbying for, which is the road user charge revenues get ring fenced just for road infrastructure and road maintenance.
Which has not happened in Australia for 40 plus years, despite what some lobbyists may say.
Yes, but the lion's share does go into roads, although it's not ring fenced, right? Most of our spending on transport at a federal level and at a state and federal level is on road, infrastructure. Yeah. It's not on public transport. It's not on active transport infrastructure. That's not unusual, by the way. That's true in most places in Europe as well.
Yeah.
With far better public transport and active transport than we've got, but ours is massively skewed. So I think our current active transport budget is 0.2% of our total roads budget.
Yeah, and topic for another day. But roads are incredibly expensive to maintain.
Yes, and ours are deteriorating. Our asset management on roads is abysmal.
Yeah,
but we should talk about asset management another time.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well. Hopefully people have enjoyed listening to I think quite a number of side excursions into other facets of transport policy. But once again, if you've got any topics you think we might be interested in covering or that you think other listeners might like, please get in touch. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and as I said, it's if you'd like to buy us a bus or train ticket, not Queensland fares, probably more like Sydney fares, then you can do that over on YouTube or Patreon. And once again, thank you for a really interesting conversation, Russell.
Yep, thank you, Graham. It's great to talk to you again, and I'll see you and the rest of the audience next time.